Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. Some women fall in love with loud men, those who speak with their chests, laugh like thunder, and argue as though the world depends on their opinions. But not NK. She had fallen for a gentle man, the kind whose presence felt like warm morning tea. Anthony was calm, precise, attentive, a man who spoke slowly and looked her in the eye when he did. Their love began quietly, almost like a whispered prayer, and grew into a partnership many envied. In Odema, where eyes watched more than they blinked, NK's marriage to Anthony became a yardstick for God did it. They had 2 children, Kamsi and Ziora, both healthy, cheerful, and sharp-mouthed like their mother. People said NK was lucky, and she would smile and reply, God makes all things beautiful in his time, Ecclesiastes 3 verse 11. But beneath her breath, she believed it wasn't just time, it was choice. She chose Anthony every day. She cooked his meals, ironed his shirts, and stayed up during his late returns from project sites. She even defended him when whispers arose about engineers who traveled and returned with strange perfumes clinging to their collars. NK believed love was a quiet discipline, not just a feeling, and she disciplined herself well, never letting cracks show. Theirs was a house of laughter and light until the shadow of Chidera's secret moved in like fog, slowly choking the clarity NK had once cherished. Chidera was her younger sister by 7 years, the last fruit of their mother's womb and the one their mother called my second chance. Where NK was cautious and calculating, Chidera was like fire on dry grass, quick to burn, quick to charm, and too wild for her own good. Yet NK never judged her. She took her in after university, gave her a room, and treated her like her third child. She's still finding her wings, NK told Anthony whenever her sister skipped morning devotion or came home with stories that had no beginning or end. Chidera was the kind of girl who could walk into a room and have the wind follow her. Men chased her with wallets open and promises sweeter than rain in Harmattan. But one evening, Chidera came back home with tears in her eyes and a silence too heavy to ignore. She was pregnant. The words came out like a swallowed scream. NK stood, unmoving, her heart pacing faster than her thoughts. Who is the father? She asked, voice calm but knotted with alarm. Chidera only sobbed harder. She never answered. Not then. Not days after. Not even when NK tried again over late-night tea. It's complicated, Chidera whispered. Their mother, when NK mentioned it, simply said, some things are better buried. If you dig too deep, you may find what you can't carry. That statement sat in NK's spirit like hot coal wrapped in linen, burning slowly, painfully, but hidden. Still, life trudged on. NK helped with antenatal visits, bought baby clothes, and defended her sister's silence when neighbors whispered about shame and upbringing. Anthony, however, grew distant around Chidera. At first, NK chalked it up to stress. He had a major project in Ifunaya City, and often returned home too tired to talk. But even in his exhaustion, something felt different. He laughed less. He prayed shorter prayers. And he avoided Chidera's gaze like she carried a curse. NK, ever the peacekeeper, told herself not to overthink it. But there were moments, the way his shoulders tensed when Chidera entered the room, how his lips pressed tightly when Amara, the baby, cried at night, that made her spirit restless. Her mother would say, don't poke sleeping dogs. But NK was beginning to wonder if the dog had already bitten and left no visible wound. On one Sunday afternoon, while rearranging old photo albums, she paused at a picture of Anthony smiling beside Chidera at her graduation. Something about the way his hand rested on Chidera's shoulder looked too familiar, too easy. Her heart skipped, but just as quickly she shut the album. The devil is a liar, she whispered. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things. 1 Corinthians 13 verse 7. She recited the verse like an armor, unaware that her war was only just beginning. It wasn't until Anthony fell ill that the first stone of her house began to wobble. He had returned from one of his sight visits looking pale, his steps sluggish and eyes weary. "Just malaria," he said, brushing it off like dust. But days passed and he only worsened. The hospital admitted him for observation. NK was with him every day, reading psalms over him, massaging his feet, telling their children Daddy would be fine. One morning, she stepped out to get medication, and when she returned, she met Chidera in the hospital corridor with Amara in her arms. He asked to see her. Chidera said quickly, her tone rehearsed. NK blinked. "He knows the baby?" "Of course," Chidera replied, eyes darting. Inside the ward, Amara saw Anthony and broke into a wide grin. "Daddy," she shouted, clapping her small hands. Time froze. NK dropped her handbag, her breath caught between shock and fury. She turned slowly to her husband, whose eyes were already wet with guilt. "Anthony," she whispered, voice trembling like dry leaves in a storm. Were you the one who got my sister pregnant?" He didn't answer. His silence cracked the air like thunder in dry season. NK stared at both of them, the man she loved, the sister she nurtured, and felt her world spin without mercy. The betrayal wasn't just a knife. It was a harvest of every seed of trust she had ever sown, reaped into thorns. The silence that followed NK's question in the hospital was not ordinary. It was the kind that could blister skin, the kind that bore the weight of truths too heavy to say out loud. Anthony didn't respond. He didn't nod. He didn't shake his head. He just looked away, as though the ceiling had more courage than his eyes could hold. Chidera stood with Amara in her arms, mouth slightly parted, unsure if she should defend herself, explain something, or disappear entirely. But NK didn't give her the chance. Her voice returned, colder than harmattan wind on a cracked heel. "You brought your child to meet her father." "In my presence." Chidera's eyes welled up, but NK wasn't interested in tears that had already betrayed her. She picked up her bag slowly, as if her dignity were tucked in every item, and she walked out of that hospital room like a woman whose feet had forgotten how to shake. Her spirit felt like cracked porcelain, beautiful, but broken in places no one could see. The corridors blurred as she made her way to the car. Her hand trembled on the steering wheel. She whispered, "The heart of man is desperately wicked. Who can know it?" Jeremiah 17, verse 9. Her chest rose and fell like a woman drowning in slow motion. For a while, she didn't drive. She sat still, the engine humming beneath her, her wedding ring heavy on her finger like an insult. The betrayal wasn't in what Anthony had done. It was in what he had hidden. And from Chidera, the sister she held like fragile glass. NK shook her head, not to dismiss the moment, but to contain it. She needed answers. She needed someone to scream at. So she turned the key and headed straight to her mother's house. The sun had begun to dip, casting an orange glow over the roofs in Odema as NK parked in front of the modest bungalow that had raised two daughters and housed a million unspoken stories. Her mother was in the kitchen, slicing okra with the calmness of a woman who thought the world was still in order. NK walked in and closed the door behind her. "Mama," she called, her voice steady but brimming. Her mother turned. "Ah, NK. How is Anthony's—" "Don't," NK interrupted, her hand raised like a barrier. "Don't act like you don't know what I just found out." Her mother frowned. The knife paused in midair. "Know what?" "That my husband fathered Chidera's child. That the man I built my life with slept with my sister. That my blood betrayed me in my own house." The words dropped one by one, each one sharper than the last. Her mother turned away and rinsed her hands in the sink. "I told her not to tell you," she said quietly, "because it would destroy you." NK blinked, the sentence hitting her like slap. "You knew?" You mama, you knew? Her voice cracked, the disbelief piling higher than her rage. How could you keep such a thing from me? Her mother sighed, slow and tired. Because some truths don't heal. They only burn. And you were happy. Happy on a lie, N.K. snapped, tears now sliding down her cheeks. I was walking around like a queen in a burning house, and you stood by with water in your hands and said nothing. Her mother tried to reach for her, but N.K. pulled away. You watched me defend them both, protect them both, and you still said nothing. Her mother lowered her eyes, guilt resting on her shoulders like a load she could no longer carry. Forgiveness is strength, she murmured. N.K. backed away. And silence is cowardice, she replied, her voice now thick. I am not your scapegoat, Mama. Not anymore. That night, N.K. did not return home. She went to Adaoras, her best friend since university, the one person who had walked through heartbreaks and high winds beside her. Adaora opened the door and saw N.K.'s face, and she didn't ask anything. She only opened her arms. N.K. collapsed into them. For hours, she didn't speak. She stared at the ceiling, reliving every smile Anthony gave her, every hug Chetara offered, and in those memories, she now saw the shadows. She saw the moments when she laughed and they smiled, not because of joy, but because of guilt. She replayed her mother's voice soft, gentle, full of betrayal. She couldn't sleep. She sat on the balcony at midnight, wind brushing her cheeks like a whisper from heaven. Her phone buzzed, but she ignored it. Anthony had called 17 times. Chetara, 6. N.K. stared at the night sky and whispered, If I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear me. Psalm 66, verse 18. Her prayers felt heavy, not because God was far, but because her heart had become a house of thorns. The children, Kamziora, were with Adaora's sister for the night. N.K. didn't want them near her until she knew what to do. She felt like her love had been fed to wolves. What kind of mother protected one daughter while sacrificing another? What kind of man could share a bed with his wife and a secret with her sister? She didn't want answers anymore. She wanted peace. Not the fake kind that silence gives, but the kind that comes after war, when everything broken has been swept away. 2 days later, N.K. returned home only to pack her things. Anthony was in the sitting room, weak, fragile, his eyes swollen from days of begging. N.K., he said, rising slowly, please, let's talk. She didn't stop. She walked past him, her steps measured, her silence heavier than any insult. It wasn't love, he tried again. It was a mistake, a terrible one. But I never stopped loving you. She zipped her bag. Do you remember our wedding vow? She asked quietly. For better or worse? He asked, hopeful. No, she said, her eyes cold. The part that said forsaking all others. He looked away. She picked up her children's clothes, neatly folded, kissed their pillows, and turned to leave. N.K., he said, almost crawling. Please don't go. She paused. You didn't think about that when you went into my sister's room. His face sank into his palms. I was weak, he sobbed. N.K. opened the door and looked at him for what might be the last time. Then live with the weight of your weakness. I'm done being your strength. And with that, she walked into a new chapter, one without answers, without closure, but with the resolve to never be a background in her own life again. The morning N.K. left Odema, the sky was gray, not the kind that threatened rain, but the kind that held grief like smoke in still air. Adaora stood at the compound gate with N.K.'s children, while the driver packed the final bags into the boot. The children didn't understand why their mother had insisted they leave so soon. Kamsi kept asking if they would return to their school after the holiday. Ziora held her teddy bear like it was the last familiar thing in her life. N.K. crouched in front of them, her voice gentle but anchored in steel. "We're starting somewhere new, all right? Somewhere quiet. Somewhere safe." She didn't use big words like divorce or betrayal. Children weren't supposed to chew on stones their parents had swallowed. As they drove through the streets of Odema, N.K. looked out the window and watched the familiar places fade. Shops where she once bought fabric, churches she used to attend with Anthony, trees under which she had once laughed with Chatara. Her mother had called the night before, but N.K. let it ring. Some calls only opened wounds, and she had bled enough. Her visa had been ready for months, originally planned for a family vacation, now repurposed as an escape plan. A new life awaited her in Ellerin, a fictional coastal town abroad with no shared history, no suspicious eyes, no shadows lurking behind every smile. She told herself she was not running. She was reclaiming. Like the Israelites leaving Egypt, she was stepping into a promise, even if the wilderness was the first thing to greet her. "Behold, I will do a new thing," she muttered under her breath, her eyes fixed ahead. "Now it shall spring forth. Shall ye not know it?" Isaiah 43 verse 19. The first weeks in Ellerin were like learning how to breathe underwater. N.K. found a small flat in the outskirts of town. Nothing fancy, but it smelled of paint and possibility. She enrolled the children in a local school, took a job at a nearby store, and tried to settle into a routine that didn't involve watching the door at night, waiting for a husband who wouldn't come, or defending a sister who didn't deserve it. The language wasn't the barrier, it was the memories that haunted her tongue. In every quiet moment, the past crept back like an unwelcome guest. She'd be washing dishes and suddenly recall Anthony's laughter echoing from the living room. She'd hear Ziora call Mummy and remember how Amara called Daddy. Every memory was a thread pulling at the hem of her piece. She prayed every night, but her prayers were less of words and more of sighs. "Lord, heal the places no one sees," she whispered as her knees kissed the cold tiled floor. It wasn't anger that lived in her heart. It was grief. A mourning for the life she thought she had, for the marriage she had nurtured like a garden only to find snakes in the soil. Sometimes she wondered what her mother was doing, whether Chidera regretted anything, whether Anthony slept at night. But then she would remind herself, no man having put his hand to the plow and looking back is fit for the kingdom of God, Luke 9 verse 62. She had no business looking back, but the heart isn't always obedient. It remembers what the mind tries to forget, and that remembering, soft, aching, silent, was its own kind of war. Months passed, and N.K. slowly found her rhythm. She began volunteering at a community center on weekends, helping displaced women find jobs and restore their confidence. It was in comforting others that she started to find her own feet again. She no longer cried at the mention of Anthony. She could now hear Ziora ask innocent questions like, "Why doesn't Daddy call?" and answer with a calm that didn't shatter her internally. Still, she carried her story like a sealed envelope in her chest, unopened, but always there. One afternoon, while cleaning out her drawer, she stumbled upon a notebook from her early days of marriage. Inside were love notes Anthony had once scribbled on yellowed pages. She paused, fingers tracing the faded ink. The words were beautiful. The man who wrote them had made her believe in forever. She closed the book and whispered, "Love never fails, but people do." She didn't cry. She simply packed the book into a box labeled past. She had stopped asking God why. Some answers unravel peace. Instead, she began asking him for strength to breathe on days when memory became too loud. There were still nights when her dreams took her back to her old house in Odema, only for her to wake with her heart thumping like a drum in a festival. But she'd get up, say a prayer, and prepare breakfast for her children. In her silence, God was teaching her resilience. In her brokenness, he was rebuilding. And though her smile had changed, less carefree, more learned, it was still hers. A scarred joy, but joy nonetheless. One Saturday morning, NK was seated at the community center's back garden, trimming leaves from the rosemary bush when her daughter ran toward her, holding a letter she had found in the mailbox. "It's from Nigeria," Ziora chirped. NK wiped her hands and took it. There was no sender name, just a familiar handwriting that made her chest tighten. She opened the envelope slowly, like unwrapping a time bomb. Inside was a letter from Anthony. Not begging, not bargaining, just a confession. He wrote that he had tried therapy, that he hadn't touched another woman since the day NK left, that he lived each day watching Amara grow while carrying the guilt of what he had done. He admitted that Chidera had come to him in a moment of weakness, that it had been months before NK ever suspected, and that he hated himself more than words could say. "I know you won't reply," he ended, "and I don't deserve it. But if you ever wonder whether I loved you, it was always you. I just failed at loving you the right way." NK folded the letter quietly. She stared into the garden, the sunlight touching her skin like God's own balm. She didn't weep. Her eyes only glistened like dew after rain. She tucked the letter into her Bible, placing it beside Psalm 147 verse 3, "He healeth the broken in heart, and bindeth up their wounds." She looked at her daughter, then at the sky. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering without bleeding. And on that morning, NK knew. She may never return to Odema, but she had finally come home to herself. The first Christmas in Ellering was quiet, the kind that tiptoed in on cold wind and nostalgia. NK didn't decorate the apartment with the usual glittering lights and garlands she used to hang with Anthony and the children back in Odema. Instead, she lit a single white candle by the window and played soft hymns on the old speaker she brought from home. The children sensed the difference, but said nothing. Campsie helped peel the yams while Ziora sat on the floor, humming and plaiting her doll's hair. For the first time in months, NK allowed herself to sit still and simply listen to the rhythm of her home, the sizzling in the pot, the distant laughter of neighbors, the occasional bark of a dog. It was different, yes, but not empty. She sat by the window that evening and watched the candle flicker. Its flame danced gently, as though whispering, "You're still standing." The pain had not disappeared, but its sting had dulled. She no longer woke up gasping for air in the middle of the night, nor did she scan every strange number for Anthony's voice. She had started writing again in her journal, not about loss, but about rediscovery. She wrote of how her faith had been stripped and stitched again. "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him," she had scribbled 2 nights before, from Job 13 verse 15. It wasn't bitterness she carried anymore. It was the quiet resolve of a woman who had danced with fire and walked out with smoke-scented skin but unburnt feet. Word from home trickled in through hushed calls and cautious messages from Edaora, who had become the unspoken bridge between NK and the ruins of her past. Chidera had moved out of their mother's house and was raising Amara alone. Their mother, once stern and immovable, had fallen ill with what doctors called stress-induced hypertension. NK didn't rejoice in that news. Her pain had never been vengeful, it was just deep. There was talk of Anthony attending therapy sessions, even taking up pastoral counseling classes at his church. NK read the updates silently. She didn't feel joy, nor anger, just an odd numbness, like touching water with gloves on. The version of herself that once wanted answers had vanished. She no longer wanted to understand their betrayal. She only wanted her own peace. Her children were growing fast, and she knew she had to protect their minds as fiercely as she had guarded her own healing. One morning, Ziora asked, "Mummy, why don't we have a daddy like other children in my class?" NK paused, her hand resting mid-air over a bowl of cereal. She took a deep breath, pulled her daughter close, and replied, "Some daddies don't live in the same house, but they still love from far away." It wasn't the full truth, but it was the piece of it her daughter could carry. "Will he come and see us one day?" the child pressed. NK looked into her eyes and said softly, "Maybe, but whether he does or not, I will always be here." And that promise, soaked in honesty, wrapped her children like a warm blanket in a world that had once grown cold. By mid-year, NK had grown into a version of herself she barely recognized, stronger, sharper, and more at peace. The community center had offered her a full-time position as a women's support coordinator, a job that came with more responsibilities but also more meaning. Every day, she listened to stories of women who had been crushed under the weight of other people's choices, widows abandoned by in-laws, immigrants cheated by lovers, girls silenced by shame. And every time NK sat across from them, she offered more than advice. She offered empathy. She had lived in that quiet hell of betrayal. She knew what it felt like to smile while your soul begged for a break. One afternoon, after a session with a woman who had been abused by her pastor, NK sat in her office and wept, not out of sadness, but because she understood how heavy secrets can become when hidden for too long. Her colleague, Miriam, walked in and held her hand. "You always pour into others," she said softly. "Let someone pour into you." That evening, NK allowed herself to sit during Bible study instead of facilitating it, and the verse that echoed in her heart was Psalm 30, verse 5. "Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning." Her night had been long, stretched by betrayal and soaked in silence, but this season of clarity, of becoming, was her morning. It came without trumpets, without announcement. It came like dew, settling gently on the bruised places of her life. The first time NK saw Amara again, it was by accident, or perhaps by divine design. She had taken the children to a small festival for African families in Eller. There was food, music, crafts, and a sense of familiarity that reminded her of markets back in Odema. As she watched Ziora play with other children near the storytelling tent, her eyes caught sight of a little girl with thick braids and Anthony's exact chin. Her breath caught. The child looked up and smiled, unaware of the quake her presence caused. Behind her stood a woman, slightly older, with tired eyes and a small smile NK knew too well. It was Chidera. Time froze. People moved around them like shadows, but the air between them was thick, swollen with everything unsaid. Chidera walked over slowly, her steps unsure. "I didn't know you were here," she said, voice fragile. NK said nothing at first. Her eyes drifted from Chidera to the child. Amara looked at her curiously. "This is your auntie," Chidera said softly. The word stung. Auntie. After all the fire and ash. NK crouched and smiled faintly. "Hello, Amara." The girl smiled back. NK rose and looked at her sister. "Why are you here?" "I got a job with the consulate," Chidera replied. "We moved last month." NK exhaled. She didn't know what to say next, so she said the truth. "I'm still healing." Chidera nodded. "Me too." The moment was brief, but it was real. They didn't hug. They didn't cry. They just stood there, two women, two wounds, and one fragile bridge between them. As NK turned to leave, Amara called out, "Bye, Auntie." And for the first time in a long while, NK smiled, not from joy, but from understanding that healing sometimes comes in whispers, not thunder. The days that followed that unexpected meeting at the festival passed like clouds carried by reluctant wind, slow but certain. NK didn't speak to Chidera again, not because she still harbored bitterness, but because she wasn't sure what her heart could carry. That accidental reunion had stirred things she thought she had buried deep beneath her skin. She kept hearing Amara's voice, soft, bright, innocent, calling her auntie, like there was no rubble beneath their feet, like no house had ever collapsed between them. There was something about children that both healed and hurt at once. Their love came without calculation, but it exposed wounds you thought were covered. NK found herself waking up earlier than usual, not to pray or prepare breakfast, but to simply sit by the window and think. Her thoughts were no longer angry. They were heavy with reflection. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't a one-time event. It was a journey with unpredictable terrain. Some days she felt light, other days she felt like she was dragging an emotional boulder up a hill. And in that quiet wrestling, she stumbled across Matthew 6 verse 14. For if ye forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. She read it 3 times. It wasn't just about Chida or Anthony anymore. It was about NK finding release, not just from their betrayal, but from the weight of being its prisoner. She didn't know what forgiveness would look like, but she was starting to understand what it should feel like, freedom. Ziora had started asking more questions about Amara after the festival. "Mummy, why did that girl look like Daddy?" she asked one evening, while combing her doll's hair beside NK's bed. NK paused. The question was gentle, but it pricked like a thorn hidden in cotton. "Because they share something," she replied cautiously. "Are they family?" the girl asked again, her eyes wide with curiosity. NK inhaled deeply. She had learned that children didn't want perfect answers, just honest ones. "Yes, baby," she said softly. "In a way, they are." Ziora nodded, not pressing further. But that night, after putting her to bed, NK stayed in the doorway and watched her daughter sleep. How would she ever explain this tangled web without planting bitterness in her children's hearts? She knew that someday they would ask deeper questions, ones about the man she married, the sister she lost, the silence she chose. Would she be able to answer without flinching? Would she be able to speak of the past without bleeding? The past wasn't just behind her, it lived in their DNA, in the faces of her children, in the distant tone of her voice whenever she mentioned Nigeria. And still, life moved. Like a stubborn clock, it ticked forward, to laugh when she could, to pray when she couldn't. One Sunday, during service, the guest preacher said something that struck her heart like lightning on dry earth. Some people hurt you because they were broken when they touched you, but if you remain in that moment, you'll live inside their mistake. She didn't shout amen. She just closed her eyes and whispered, "Lord, help me not live in the ruins." It was a chilly afternoon when Anthony called. NK had changed her number twice since arriving in Ellerin, but Adara had passed her new contact to him recently, without her consent. "I'm sorry," Adora had said, "but I think you need closure." So when the phone rang and she saw his name, her heart beat with both dread and curiosity. She didn't answer the first time, nor the second. But by the third ring, something within her said, "Face the wound or let it fester." His voice came low, careful, as if unsure it still belonged in her ears. "NK," he said. Silence. I don't expect you to forgive me, but thank you for not poisoning the children against me." She didn't speak. "I know I failed you. And every day I wake up with that shame pressing down on my chest like a stone." Still, NK said nothing. She had no appetite for long confessions. "I just wanted you to know," he continued, "that your absence taught me what your presence used to cover." That line made her blink. It was honest. Painfully so. "I'm not calling to reopen anything," he added. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. And thank you for loving me when I didn't even love myself well." The call lasted 5 minutes. NK didn't say more than 3 words. But after it ended, she stood by the window and wept, not because his words hurt, but because they didn't anymore. The fire he lit had burned down to ashes, and all that remained was the wind carrying what used to be. Weeks later, NK began journaling letters she never intended to send. One to her mother, another to Chida, and one more to herself. In the letter to her mother, she wrote about the ache of feeling unprotected, about the silence that spoke louder than any betrayal. But she also acknowledged that her mother was human, flawed, perhaps afraid, perhaps trying to preserve one daughter while failing the other. To Chida, she wrote not with venom, but with depth. "You were my sister before you became my wound. I may never understand your choices, but I no longer need to." And to herself, she penned a reminder, "You are not what they did. You are who you chose to become after it." These letters were never mailed. She folded them neatly and kept them inside her Bible, beside Isaiah 61 verse 3, which spoke of giving beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning. One morning, as she sat watching Kamsi and Ziora paint on the balcony, she smiled quietly to herself. The sun fell on her skin like an answered prayer. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew this: she had walked through the valley of betrayal and found her way to a meadow of grace. And even though her heart still bore scars, they no longer bled. They no longer whispered shame. They told a story, a deep, difficult, but victorious story. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right, she would close her eyes and whisper, "Thank you, God. I didn't just survive. I bloomed." The months that followed brought a strange peace, not loud or triumphant, but the kind that crept in through the cracks of Nk's routine and sat quietly beside her each morning. She no longer flinched when the past crossed her mind. It had become like a scar on the heel, tender but no longer painful to touch. The children were thriving. Kamsi had joined the local football club and walked around with the confidence of a boy who felt the world was big and conquerable. Ziora had taken up singing in church, her tiny voice floating over the microphone like a dove in clear skies. NK would sit at the back pew, listening with tears tucked behind her smile. Each day, her life resembled more of what she prayed for than what she had planned. Her evenings were slow and quiet, filled with laughter from the children's room, the smell of jollof rice in the air, and the constant hum of worship music flowing from the small speaker in the corner. One evening, while reading from the Psalms, her eyes landed on a verse she had read 1,000 times before, but now it struck with new meaning. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit," Psalm 34, verse 18. She paused. Her spirit had once been crushed, ground to fine dust beneath betrayal and silence, but she had been preserved. And now, in the softness of a new life, she finally understood. God had never left. He had simply waited for her to rise from the rubble and see his hand through the dust. A letter arrived for NK one Thursday afternoon as she was sorting laundry in the living room. It came in a brown envelope, addressed in cursive handwriting she didn't recognize at first glance. Her heart didn't leap, nor did her hands tremble. She had learned to open things slowly, to read life in measured portions, like someone once burned by boiling water. She sat at the dining table, tore the envelope carefully, and unfolded the contents. It was a letter from Chitara. The writing was careful, with pauses in places where one could sense the hesitation behind the words. "I don't know what right I have to speak again, but I want to try," it began. Chitara wrote about motherhood, the sleepless nights, the sudden illnesses, the tender joys of watching Amara grow. She confessed that she often caught glimpses of Anthony in the child's expressions, and how it made her both proud and ashamed. "I don't know if you will ever forgive me, but I want you to know I carry the weight of it all," she wrote. "You were the sister I admired most, and yet I became the reason your world cracked." She didn't ask for reconciliation, nor did she make excuses. It was just honesty, raw and layered, like a wound scabbing over. At the end, she added, "If Amara ever asks about you, I will tell her the truth, that you were the woman who chose healing over hatred." NK folded the letter gently, her eyes glistening. She simply whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for mercy undeserved." Then she stood, walked to the window, and stared into the horizon, as though something in the distance had just released her. A few weeks later, NK received an invitation to speak at a women's event in the heart of Ellerin. The theme was beauty after breaking. At first, she hesitated. She had grown used to sharing bits of her story in safe spaces, but this was different, public, visible, vulnerable. But the more she prayed, the more a stirring grew within her. So she accepted. On the day of the event, dressed in a simple white gown with coral beads on her wrist, an echo of her roots, she stood before the crowd and spoke with a grace that didn't come from strength, but from surrender. She didn't name names or spill timelines. She spoke of betrayal, of silence, of starting again in a city where no one knew her past. She spoke of raising children in the middle of grief, of choosing joy like one picks up broken glass, carefully, intentionally. She ended by quoting Isaiah 61 verse 3, just as she had written in her journal, to give unto them beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness. When she finished, there was no applause at first, only silence, deep, reflective silence. Then, one by one, women began to stand, some wiping tears, others nodding. N.K. smiled gently, knowing she hadn't just told her story. She had given language to theirs. And in that room, something sacred happened. Women who had been bent by pain began to lift their heads. They saw in her not just survival, but the possibility of resurrection. On the drive home from the event, N.K. sat in the back seat with her children, the city lights of Ellerin casting soft shadows across their faces. Kamsi was talking about the games he had played with other kids at the event, while Ziora kept humming the praise song from earlier. N.K. leaned her head back and closed her eyes. Her mind wandered, first to Odima, to the house she left behind, then to Anthony's voice on the phone, to her mother's sighs, to Chara's tear-soaked apology folded inside her Bible. But those memories no longer pulled her under. They floated like old leaves in a calm stream. She opened her eyes, looked out the window, and for the first time in years, she did not feel the ache of what was lost. She only felt the warmth of what had been restored. Not the marriage, not the sisterhood, but herself. And that was more than enough. When they got home, she tucked her children into bed, kissed their foreheads, and sat on the edge of her bed with her Bible open. She didn't search for a particular verse this time. She just let the pages fall where they would. Her eyes landed on Romans 8 verse 28, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God. She smiled, closed the Bible, and turned off the lamp. As darkness wrapped the room, N.K. lay down and whispered, "It wasn't the ending I expected, but it's the peace I needed." And with that, she drifted to sleep, covered not in bitterness, not in regret, but in grace, deep and wide like the sea that now cradled the city she called home. If there's anything beneath the silence teaches us, it's that healing is not a straight line. It's a winding path, full of pauses, trembles, and quiet victories. Sometimes the people who break us are the very ones we never imagined could. And when life delivers that kind of betrayal, it's not weakness to step away, it's wisdom. Do not let anyone make you feel guilty for choosing peace. You owe no one your suffering to keep the illusion of unity alive. Like N.K., you can walk away from the noise, the lies, and the weight of what others think you should endure. You can choose to build a life where your voice is not just heard, but honored. Let forgiveness be your freedom, not their reward. And remember, even the deepest wounds can become sacred spaces when grace meets them. Your story does not end in pain. It may pass through fire, yes, but it will not leave you in ashes. Keep walking, even if your feet are slow. Keep hoping, even if your heart is heavy. One day, the same mouth that whispered, "Why me?" will boldly declare, "Thank God I made it." Thank you for being a God who sees every tear, who hears the groanings we cannot put into words. Lord, for every listener nursing wounds from betrayal, heartbreak, or deep disappointment, wrap them in your peace that passes all understanding. We ask, Father, that you restore what was broken, not by replacing it, but by rebuilding something stronger, something sacred. Let every listener who has walked through the fire come out refined and not consumed. Turn their mourning into dancing, their silence into songs of victory, and their shame into testimonies that shake the earth. Father, teach them how to forgive without losing themselves. Teach them how to heal without growing bitter. Let them rise daily with courage in their bones and grace on their lips. And when memories come to haunt, let your word be louder. Let your promises be their anchor. Give them a new beginning, the kind that makes them say, only God could have done this. Let joy return to their hearts like dawn after a long night. Let their lives be evidence that even after betrayal, love still lives, peace still flows, and destiny still speaks. In the name above every name, Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.